Dogman on campus. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once encountered a dogman in my youth, or maybe it was twice. It might have been a werewolf, as we were in Wisconsin at the time. This is one of those stories people used to tell in my generation about seeing a monster while in a lover's lane. I don't hear those kinds of stories as much anymore, and I don't know if it's because the monsters went away, or maybe the lovers' lanes went away. At any rate, this was 1971, and back then, young men and women used to be attracted to each other. They used to get a hold of a car and drive off into the woods, looking for some solitude. Sometimes they found what they were looking for. In our case, we found the Dogman. One time, my college girlfriend, who I'll call Lara, and I were driving along Lake Creek Road, aka County Highway West, looking for a place to park the car off under some trees and relax a bit. This is over in Rhinelander. On the way there, as we were driving over Boom Lake, I could have sworn I saw something weird and large in the lake. It was a very dark shape, something like a small head at the end of a long neck sticking out of the water. I asked Lara, "Did you see that?" And she said, "Did I see what?" without looking up from her mirror. She was doing something to her face with makeup, even though we were only driving to the woods. I pointed toward the water and I said, "There, do you see that thing there?" And she asked me, "Where there?" Again, without looking up from her mirror. By then we were past the water and back into driving in the trees, and it was too late to look, so I just dropped the subject. Of course, Lara started getting hostile, demanding that I explain where she should look. She had finished with her makeup, and now she wanted to start a fight. I told her it didn't matter anymore, and we should just talk about something more fun, like school busing, or the Pentagon Papers. She wouldn't let up, and when we finally found a spot to park, she refused to snuggle until I told her what I had wanted her to look at. I gave up, and I told her that I thought I'd seen a lake monster, like the Loch Ness Monster. But I wanted her to look as well, because I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light. Well, you would have thought I was Shecky Green by her reaction. She thought it was so funny that I thought I saw a monster in Boom Lake, and she got really mean about it, making fun of me. I got out of the car to stand outside dramatically under a tree, like I had seen people do in soap opera type movies. I just wanted to be left alone for a little while to let the sting of her nasty words lessen. That was when she got out of the car to shout more insulting things at me, and I turned around to return the favor. Soon we were in a full-on shouting match, and it was a wonder they didn't hear us over in the next county. We were yelling over each other. I was defending myself from her smears and lies, and she was trying to speak too loud to hear me at all. Suddenly, she was screaming in a different way, like a scream queen from the movies. There were no words in this scream, just complete and utter fear. Realizing she was shouting because of something behind me, I spun around and saw a hairy man-like beast standing on two legs. My eyes met his chest, and I had to tilt my head back to see that he had some kind of a tall-eared, long-snouted animal head, way up, about 11 or 12 feet in the air. This guy was literally around twice my size, as I'm 5'11". It bared its teeth at me, which were those of a meat eater, and it growled as its eyes shifted to looking intensely angry at me for whatever reason. I took a step back, and the dog-like man took a step forward. Its feet were like dog paws, but they looked larger than my hands. I took another step back, hoping I was remembering where the car was behind me. I thought that if I continued progressing backward slowly, I could get into the car without alarming the beast. when my car horn started beeping loudly behind me. I very nearly seized up in shock. The dog-headed man retreated gracefully into the woods as I turned and ran for the car. We tore out of that place, and neither of us had any desire to argue any more that night, or to hang around in the dark woods either. Now, you would have thought that would be the end of the story, but as it turned out, that was not to be the case. Lara and I were supposed to go on a double date with this other couple of students from our college. The other guy and I were both on the football team, but we were the only two non-rich guys on the team. When my buddy came up broke for this date, I didn't have enough to cover 4 people. He suggested we walk out to the edge of campus where there was nature, and it was quiet. Well, it was quiet until we got there. Lara had been looking forward to going out to eat, so now she was hungry and wanted to go home. The two of us got into a shouting match, just as bad as the one we had in the Lover's Lane by Boom Lake that other night. Our friends, who were the reason we were fighting, got up and left us there squabbling. Lara and I kept getting harsher and harsher with each other. And then, crash, out of the blue, someone jumped out of the woods and ran directly toward us. When I saw how big that guy was, I screamed like a baby. When I realized it was that same Dogman again, I think my squeal hit a pitch too high for human hearing. This double-sized dog demon was upon me in 2 or 3 seconds and casually shoved me to the ground, where I landed, roughly. The way I was sprawled out and off balance, the creature could have done anything it wanted to me. It could have roughed me up, or it could have beaten me down. I braced for impact, expecting my life to be ended, or severely altered, in a painful way. Thud, 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 I could hear the beast running away on its hind legs. Lara was on me, checking me to see if I was all right. And the two of us sat there, watching this inhuman, prehistoric monster from some other reality run across the campus and back into some woods on the other side. That animal had remembered me, and he also remembered that he didn't like me. I couldn't tell if he'd been stalking me, or if he just came upon us randomly. This made me paranoid, and I never wanted to go anywhere that had tree cover after that. Things got weirder and weirder until Lara and I couldn't date each other anymore. I quit the football team. I became a weird sort of guy, keeping to myself and peering out my windows, wondering if the Dogman was out there. I moved away from the Midwest and into an urban setting. After a long time, I calmed down and became a productive member of society. But I still have phobias about the country, or even about parks sometimes. Once upon a time, I was the big man on campus. That is, until I met Dogman on campus. I hope you enjoyed that all-new Dogman story. That one and this entire episode are brought to you by 2 of our most vital patrons, namely CS and Godzilla Tim. You'll see various stories that could not have been made without them. And then, at the very end, our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman, will come on out and explain how you can become an executive producer, just like Godzilla Tim and CS. But that won't happen for a while, because we've got almost 2 hours of Dogman stories coming up right now. 3 weird northwestern Pennsylvania Dogman stories, allegedly true, submitted by you. Number 1. The Flying Dragon Chasing the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a kid growing up in northwestern Pennsylvania, over by Lake Erie, my father used to tell me the tale of his encounter with what he called the Hound of Hydetown. This was not an ordinary hound. In fact, it stood up like a human being, and according to my dad, this horrifying creature might possibly have saved his life. Then again, maybe he was actually trying to eat my father and just failed. It's hard to say. That's kind of why I think he would tell the story over and over again, to try and figure out what the Dogman's intentions actually were. The way the tale went, it had just gotten dark at night, and Dad was driving east, back into Hydetown on Route 408. Just a ways before the road was about to intersect with Patterson Road, this big old Dogman jumped out into the street in front of him. I'm talking about one of the big 7 or 8 footers, not any kind of juvenile. It had a big wolf head on top of huge linebacker shoulders. It jumped out onto the road and stopped in front of the car, as though he'd been waiting for my father to show up. Although Dad slowed down significantly, at the last second, he saw a way to spin out and around the big, long-snouted, upright canine, and he managed to get around the beastman, then start to bring the car back up to speed. It was like a GTA moment for him by the way he tells the story. So, as he's about to drive past Patterson Road, bam, out onto Route 408 in front of him, spills this maniac, driving way over the speed limit. Dad said he was able to slow down and let the moron get in front of him without anything bad happening. But if that Dogman had not slowed him down a few seconds earlier, they might very well have had a very severe and nasty crash. So in a sense, you could say that my father's life was saved by the Dogman. But was that the creature's intention? Or was it an accidental side result? This all happened before I was born, before my father even met my mother, and yet he still really to this day does not know what the Dogman's intentions were. So now fast forward around 40 years. By this point, I'm alive, and I've just turned 28, which makes this second story I'm about to tell 15 years old now this month. I was driving back toward Hydetown to visit Dad for my birthday, which is in November. Ironically, I was on Route 408, the same road my father had his Dogman encounter on. That was miles further to the west, however, having just passed through Townville. It was while I was driving alone through State Gameland 69 that the one cryptid sighting of my life happened. When the figure burst out of the foliage off in the distance on the right and onto the road, I thought at first that I was looking at some kind of a man, most likely a shorter but very muscularly built gentleman. The next thing that grabbed my notice, however, was a dark shadow being cast down upon the humanoid, and the other, larger thing gliding through the air over the tops of the trees. I thought this was a kite for some reason until I saw the wings flap, and I realized it was animated and therefore alive. The wings were not bird wings, though. They seemed to be made of sheets of material more like sailboat sails. I slowed the car down to a complete stop, and I craned my neck forward, trying to see this scene a little bit more clearly. The humanoid turned left onto the road and was now running in my general direction. I remember putting the car in reverse and sort of pulling backward and into an impromptu parking spot alongside the road, and then calmly continuing to watch the spectacle. In retrospect, though, I think I was more stunned into numbness than actually calm. When these creatures or things were off in the distance, I didn't grasp the relative size of either one of them. As the figure on the road drew closer, I came to understand that it was not a short man at all. It was a very, very large, bipedal creature with bodily proportions more like that of a shorter human male. In other words, it was wide, like a 5-foot-tall muscle man, sized up 2 times, but keeping the proportions of the shorter and wider man. So what from a distance looked like a man a foot shorter than myself had sure started to look like someone twice my size, and probably more than twice my weight and mass. And if that running figure was twice as large or larger than I had thought, Well, looking up, I tried to understand what that ginormous flying thing was. Could it be a manned vehicle? The more I saw, the more I was convinced that it was not a craft, but a living thing. Just a very, very large living thing. Note that I did not say a large bird. Besides the wings seeming to be made of smooth sails, the body itself looked more lizard-like to me than bird-like. I remember from school that the Archaeopteryx bird was partially a dinosaur or lizard, and it's generally thought that birds evolved from certain kinds of dinosaurs. I have to say, after witnessing whatever the heck it was that was following the wide man over those trees, that I wonder if creatures can devolve as easily as they evolve. Like, what if this flying bat lizard was actually a descendant of birds? What if nature's decided to revive some older models? That might be the best way to describe it. A flying bat lizard. The wings were more like bat wings than anything else I know of, although they weren't exactly bat wings either. The neck was longer than any bat neck, though, and there was no fur, as far as I could tell with my limited view. I thought that it was either grayish or greenish, but the lighting was not so good, so I might be wrong. It seemed like its skin would either be smooth or scaly if I had been able to see it up close. In either case, it was somewhat slick-looking like a snake, not baggy or craggy in the way some four-legged lizards or alligators can be. The head of the flying lizard was another story altogether. Here it resembled both a carnivorous dinosaur and a dragon from mythology. It had horns on its head in multiple places, each differently sized, and each in different states of disrepair. It was clear even from the first glance that this flying battle beast had been fighting to survive for quite some time already. When my eyes came back down to the road, I got a few-second look at our bipedal friend, and much of what I'd been thinking about that fellow changed drastically. And suddenly, it was not a man. Its legs were not a man's legs. Its head was not a man's head. Its eyes glowed too brightly to be eyeshine. It looked like its eyes were literally lit from within. I don't know what I was seeing or what caused that, but it looked like lights inside each eye were turned up high. Now, what could cause that effect? The figure had a head like a canine, a long-snouted feral wolf or hyena or jackal or something. It looked terrifying to me even as it ran for its life from the much larger flying creature. It was more like a dog than a human, except that it ran upright, like a man, and its chest was more humanoid than canine. That head rested right on the wide-ass shoulders with no visible neck as far as I could see. Its front legs were much closer to what I would call arms than any dog legs I've ever witnessed, and they pumped back and forth as he ran. I hadn't even consciously noticed this until the dog-headed hairy man had already jumped in, creating a big splash. But there was some kind of a body of water directly to the left of the road right over there. A swamp or pond or lake. I couldn't really see in the dark. Well, that Dogman ran out into that, and that bat lizard dragon dove down over the highway and toward that black water. The Dogman dove down to protect himself, but the flying dinosaur beast crashed his predator head under that water and tried again to grab the other one up in his immense jaws. I got my car started and back in gear as I watched what I could of this battle. I could not see what was happening under the water, but I saw the huge flying lizard flailing and flapping about. I was imagining all the things it must have been doing to the man-beast who had dived under the surface. Well, as I prepared to pull away, I was stunned to see the wings cease flapping. In fact, all struggle seemed to stop. and the entire body of that flying battlefield monster sank silently under the surface. It looked impossible even as it happened. The body of water didn't seem large enough to hold a creature that size, and yet the unmoving body got swallowed up somehow. In some way, I could not really understand. And then, as though he had just finished a presentation on third quarter financial projections, the Dogman reappeared, trotting out of the water, shaking himself off to dry himself a bit, and then disappearing back into the woods that he initially ran out of. All in a day's work for the Midwest monster. I drove the rest of the way I needed to go that night with one thing on my mind, and that was to get a desk job that happens during the day. I was sick of placing myself into situations where I might have to deal with the flying dragon chasing the Dogman. Story number 2. The Conneaut Canine. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw a Dogman climb up out of the water in Conneaut Lake, but what was far worse was that he saw me. This is a story about the Midwest Dogman in the part of Pennsylvania that's up inside the Great Lakes region. If you're familiar with the Philadelphia Phillies who've been in the news lately, then you're aware of the eastern side of Pennsylvania, over by New York and New Jersey. If you're familiar with the marginally or arguably less famous Pittsburgh Pirates, then you've heard of western Pennsylvania, where there have traditionally been a lot of Bigfoot and cryptid reports. The area to the north of Pittsburgh and to the west of the Allegheny National Forest is directly connected to Lake Erie, and it's where a lot of cryptid sighting reports go to die. Most of us around here have to earn a living, and there's just something about the culture of the area that pushes people toward hiding their problems from prying eyes. Very few are going to be loudly declaring themselves victims around this region. If you're hurt, you hide your limp, and you keep going. So, when people are bothered by cryptids over around here, they'll often keep it to themselves and try to deal with it as silently as they can. Although I live here now and I have lived and worked in the region for 27 years, I was not born here, and I have no qualms at all about sharing my Dogman story with you, as long as you leave my name out of this. I was at a break at my job, and so I went out behind my boss's place, where there's a sort of a central docking location, I guess. It's a rectangular grass-covered lawn that extends out into the water, and it's surrounded by little piers used as docking areas. All the docks attached to the other docks in different ways to make it easier to get into and out of the luxury boats that these well-heeled individuals owned and enjoyed. Now, I was not one of those people. I was just hired staff, getting a peek into that lifestyle for a couple minutes before getting back to work. I heard a splashing sound to my left and looked over to see a dripping wet bear man climbing up onto a little metal walkway pier thing alongside a boat. I watched as he shook the water out of his fur, just like any other dog would do it. But then, the creature stood up on its hind legs, and then it spotted me. For some reason, I was surprised that this creature I was staring at decided to stare back at me. It was like I thought I was watching a movie instead of real life. But when our eyes met, I started to understand that this was real life, not a movie, and I sort of let out a little yelping sound. Immediately alarmed and threatened by my uncool behavior, the beast ran toward me on its hind legs, faster than I'd ever seen a guy that big run before. Come to think of it, I'd never seen a guy that big, full stop. I took off in the opposite direction, ran down the little dock there and dove into the water, swimming for the shoreline. I'm lucky that Dogman didn't seem to think I was worth the trouble of following, because I've never been all that fast a swimmer. I'm pretty sure that the creature could have caught me if he had tried, which is why I figure he just must have wanted to spook me and send me off out of his space. I get asked by people for a more detailed description of the creature since it was pretty well lit compared to most Dogman sightings and experiences. While that's true, the creature was also very wet, dripping wet in fact. I can tell you it was extremely large, like Scooby-Doo or Marmaduke large when down on all fours, and much taller than I am or was when it stood up on its hind legs. And it did not stand awkwardly as a bear or some kinds of apes do. It stood as naturally on 2 legs as on 4, and I did see it take 2 or 3 steps before I reacted and began running away. It was extraordinarily agile, especially considering that it was maneuvering on a wet metal surface, being rocked back and forth in the lake. No bear could have done that, not even on a fluke. I don't know what officially existing animal could have done what I saw this fellow do. Since we were right there in the Great Lakes region, I don't see how it would be that outrageous to jump to the conclusion that this was a Michigan Dogman or a Wisconsin werewolf up in the little northwestern chimney of Pennsylvania. But in case you're uncomfortable calling it either of those things, I'd be perfectly content to continue referring to the creature as the Conneaut canine. Story 3. The Wolfman of Warren. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've heard you say that you like weird Pennsylvania Dogman stories. I've got one that seems pretty weird to me. It took place kind of far west, though, in Warren, PA. That's only 60 or 70 miles away from Lake Erie. So you're really in the Midwest, even though you're still in PA. So I don't know if it's the land here, the magnetic qualities of the region, or maybe something in the air. But we do have a history of utterly bizarre reports and sightings throughout our lovely state. We've got monsters, aliens, red-eyed robot Bigfoot, flying dinosaurs, and more UFOs than anything else, at least if you believe all the witnesses. I myself am a witness, and I have to admit that I wonder what the true nature was of what I witnessed. So first let me tell you what that was. Where Elk Road intersects with the high-tension wire cutaway, I saw, or I swear to you that I at least thought that I saw, a large tan and orange-colored dogman collecting yellow and purple flowers, which were growing off both sides of the road on that early evening. It would have been a beautiful and peaceful, idyllic scene if it weren't for the fact that this man was so clearly a canine of some sort. I have sometimes called it a golden retriever man, but people took the term too literally. It did not have the face of a golden retriever, but its fur was a similar shade, and also grew fairly long like some golden retrievers I've met. It did not have that friendly demeanor that I remember from my friend's pet dogs, though. Although it did have similar ears and a similar long snout, there was just something nasty about this interpretation of the familiar theme. I always thought big old orange floppy dog ears were cute and lovable, but somehow, the way this beast carried them off, they were legitimately intimidating and off-putting. I watched the beast, unable to move a single muscle of my body, out of the most severe fear reaction I'd ever had. I don't really remember stopping the car, but I remember trying to will myself to move my foot back onto the gas pedal and remove myself from that situation. I don't think that I was literally frozen, and I don't think I was having a sleep paralysis moment either. I think I was just so surprised and so curious that those sensations overruled me taking action to get out of there. I might be kidding myself, though. I might have been in a sort of a dream state, or I might have been under some sort of influence that I do not understand. It's very hard for me to say what was happening with any degree of certainty. The dogman was holding flowers in his left arm and gathering more with his right. It was then that I noticed how much his front paws resembled clawed versions of human hands. He was picking flowers as though he were going on a date that night. I wondered if I might be observing a female. But I don't really know how to tell the difference if you can't see the parts of the dog that I could not see from my angle. Suddenly out of nowhere, someone was banging on my car window, asking me if I was okay. I started telling them that I was watching the dogman pick flowers, but then I saw that this man must have scared the dogman away. I couldn't see him anywhere on the scene, but I could see flowers missing from the areas where he'd picked most of them from. Maybe I hallucinated this experience? Because extra low frequency waves from those wires overhead have sometimes been known to mess with people's internal mentations. In other words, it can get you to thinking you're seeing things that aren't really there. At least that's a sort of a mainstream view of it. Maybe those waves simply open you up to seeing things that are really there, but which you might not normally be on the wavelength to notice. I know, and I admit, this story is not scary in the way your episodes usually are, but believe me, it scares me that I have zero explanation for it. Once you've had something happen to you that you can't completely comprehend, but also can't debunk, you realize that the universe is not playing fair. Whenever we think we have it all figured out, the universe tosses us another bit of reality that's so fantastic that it seems unreal. And that's why I think there's something more to the Dogman mystery than just a kind of wolf that walks upright. And so I still feel unnerved and frightened ever since the day I encountered the Wolfman of Warren. Guess who's back? I'm talking about him, the one and only Godzilla Tim. He's the kind of guy who's all the rage. He donates high on our webpage. He's on the level, no flam or flim. Start the revels, Godzilla Tim. Dogman, Bug Snout, Halloween. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have only seen one cryptid in my life, but I didn't know it was a cryptid when I saw it. This happened back when I was a kid, and I was being led, along with other kids, on a trick-or-treat adventure, with my Sunday school teachers guiding us, one in the front and one in the back. We were in a sort of suburban but sort of, I guess, semi-urban area in Whittlesey, Wisconsin. Now, because this is a memory from my younger childhood, I mostly remember some visuals and the looks on the faces of the adults. What happened was we had to walk down a block that was undeveloped in order to get to a few more houses of parishioners who were presumed to be friendly and safe to take us kids to see. Walking down the undeveloped block was a very creepy memory. It felt like it got dark very suddenly, like as a storm must have suddenly started brewing, and a little chilly wind started up as well. We all walked just a little tiny bit faster without being asked to. Something was really strange about nearly everything, to be honest. We had a yard full of overgrown grass and weeds to our left, and to our right across the street was the sorriest patch of woods you'd ever want to see. I don't know why, but a number of trees on the edge of the woodline seemed to be dead or dying, and some of them made creaky noises like they were about to fall over. Besides the creaking wood, our quiet footsteps, and the sound of the increasingly angry wind, the only other noise I noticed was this creepy slurping sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think back on it. When we got far enough down the block, we could see it. A very large man was there, I thought, but then I thought I saw it was a giant teddy bear. And another step or two, squinting into the darkness, I could have sworn it was some kind of a werewolf man. I turned to one of the adults to ask them what that was, but she put her finger over her mouth, and I realized she didn't know what that was either. For the first time in human history, kids became silent without even being asked to. We marched, eyes opened as wide as our shocked mouths, staring across the street at the strangest sight I imagine I'll ever see. When we had advanced to the correct angle, we could see that this hairy, tall humanoid had his face smashed into a cavity in a dead or dying tree. When he pulled his head back out, we could see that he had a long snout, like a wolf. At the end of it seemed to be covered in maggots and grubs that it was licking off and swallowing. The look on its face as it came up for air was one of absolute bliss, like Homer Simpson while eating a chocolate bar. That was one of the top 3 grossest things I'd seen up to that point, which lets you know that I saw some extra sickening stuff back in those days. We all watched as this dog tongue that looked long enough to hang a grown man with licked bug and worm parts up from off his face, and then he let out this sort of belch that I at the time thought was a growl. I remember about a third of the class dropping down to a squatting position, sort of instinctively. I realized it was the upright walking wolf or dog giving a bug burp before I was even all the way down, and our collective and sudden movement had caused the Dogman to notice our presence across the street from him. He turned his head, gazed at us in a general sense, and did not seem to be interested very much in our presence at all. After letting out a contented sigh, he shoved his face back into the cavity in the dead or dying tree, and we could hear him making happy eating sounds inside the old dry wood as we got back up on our trembling legs and continued down the block silently. Even once we got across the street and back in front of houses decorated for the season, I still felt too intimidated to speak. I kept looking over my shoulder for the rest of the night, even though we took a different and safer route back. I hate to think of what would have happened that night if the Dogman felt that costumed brats tasted as good as worms, bugs, and maggots. Since that happened before my sister was born, and since we moved out of Whittlesea before very long, I had always sort of wondered if I had dreamed that story, or what if we had seen a bear, and my childhood memory remembered it as a dogman or werewolf. Even a bear in town that close to houses would be quite a memorable sight, to be certain. I also wondered if it had just been a dream, or a scene from an old movie perhaps. Then one of the 2 ladies who served as our guides that night somehow found me online. It turned out that she had been trying to find any of us kids from back then for years to see if we remembered that strange Halloween night. When I asked her if it really was a werewolf, or if I was misremembering a German shepherd or something, she nearly exploded with information and details from her version of what happened on that night. She said the creature had gray fur, and that bears generally do not come in gray. So either I'm remembering it largely as it really happened, or else the 2 of us are both completely bonkers, which, come to think of it, is not necessarily impossible. But we both agree on our versions of what happened that night, so many years ago, that we both think of as the Dogman, Bug Snout, Halloween. Hubert the werewolf was really a dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I have a Halloween Dogman story for you that's not as long as most of the stories you run. I hope it's long enough for you to use it. This happened when I was a kid, living in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Williamsport isn't big or small. If you're from Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, then it'll seem small though. It's an old school American town, like something out of a Spielberg movie in a lot of ways, but has some old buildings and homes that can also give it a sort of a Stephen King vibe here and there, even though it's located well south of New England. Like much of Pennsylvania, it's modern, and yet surrounded by some of the most ancient nature in the world. You got, I think, 4 state forests near us, 1 official wild area, and a state park right near us too. So Williamsport is both very current and ancient at the same time. I haven't been there since 2011, but when I was a kid in the 1980s, you could go from door to door trick-or-treating without any adult supervision at all. Well, at least that's what my friends and I did, and maybe we just got lucky. But we never got attacked or poisoned or anything like that. I mean, if you're a pack of 9 or 10, 13 or 14-year-olds, you're actually dangerous. People are a bit afraid of you, to be honest. I mean, old people are either charmed by you and give you candy, or else they stare at you wide-eyed, convinced you're gonna mug them. When we went trick-or-treating, we felt powerful. The last couple of years, anyhow. And part of the reason people gave us space when we walked down the street was that one of our friends, who I'm gonna call Hubert, was actually taller than most of the adults in town. Hubert was like Howard Stern or Joey Ramone. He was Aaron Judge, but skinnier. I think he was 6'2" or 3" already, back when he was 13 or 14. He kept growing for the next 2 or 3 years that I knew him. If he kept that pace up, I'd say by now he should be about 1 or 2 miles tall. Every year, Hubert would wear the same Halloween costume, which was a werewolf costume that his mother would always make taller for him each year. It had this extra creepy head that looked like a real dog's head, but taxidermied. It wasn't, but it sure looked like he was wearing a giant dead dog head over his face. The rest of the costume was always a very cheap fuzzy or furry material, dyed dark brown or black, sewn into a one-piece bodysuit like pajamas, sort of. He had some old boots that either he or his mom had painted dog nails on the front of, and I think there was a tail in the back, probably, but I'm not sure. This was not cosplay level stuff, but it was a better costume than most of the rest of us guys had back in those days. Nevertheless, we were kids, and we could be jerks sometimes, so we would kid Hubert about his costume being the same every year. What we didn't tell him was that we all wished our moms were as handy as his was. It was just jealousy, but I don't think Hubert understood that. So we would meet up outside by the mailbox in front of my friend Rick's house. They would rig up this life-size plastic skeleton so it looked like it was hanging out, leaning on the mailbox, and biding its time. We'd abide along with the bony dude until we had a quorum. Then we'd begin our evenings begging and candy mongering. That night, when Hubert showed up, he hung to the back, staying in the shadows. I felt bad about that. I figured he didn't want to get picked on anymore, so he was holding back. We had really taken it too far. So we got to the very first house that we always went to, which was where a really nice old lady and her very cranky husband lived. She always loaded us down more if we went there with empty bags. There were other people who would only give you a lot of candy if you already had a lot. They were competing with their neighbors, and so would give us more if they felt they'd lose status otherwise. Not this nice lady, though. She just wanted to make sure that you were loaded down with all kinds of sugar, even if you never even visited house number 2. So after giving us each enough candy for 5 years, she motioned to Hubert, standing behind us in the darkness. "Don't you want some candy too, dear?" she called out to him. There was silence for a beat. And then that big old werewolf costume lurched forward into the light. and we all gasped. This costume had an entirely different head. It didn't look like a taxidermied wolf. It looked like a prehistoric wolf, a living wolf from the caveman or dinosaur times. Teeth way too large to even fit in his long snouted mouth. Ears long enough to belong to a hare, but on a head big enough to belong to a young Tyrannosaurus. The fur costume did not hang loosely from Hubert's gangly frame. This costume somehow made his ribs look canine, not human. It made his hands look more like paws. It also caused his legs to look bent in the way a dog's legs bend, so that they stand on their toes when compared to human feet. Everything about that year's costume was more sophisticated than in previous years. And in that souped-up gear, Hubert raced forward and snatched the candy from the nice old lady. I mean, he snatched all the candy. Then he turned and roared at us, not like a lion, but sort of more like he was King Kong or Godzilla or something. And when he did, you could see his tongue moving. You could see his mouth drooling. And you could tell that this was a real, living animal. We dropped our candy, and it grabbed what it could carry. Then we watched as it ran around toward the backyard of the lady, heading toward the state park. We stood there stunned, and then we heard Hubert calling to us. Looking around, we saw he was late and running to catch up. He wasn't dressed as a werewolf or Dogman at all. That year, he had switched to wearing a basketball practice uniform, the kind with a jacket and long pants. It was October after all. You can't expect him to wear basketball shorts outside. So, ironically, the only guy who didn't get to see the real werewolf steal our candy was the guy who we had thought was the werewolf all the time. And that's because Hubert the werewolf was really a dogman. Dogman versus Halloween. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This happened, I guess, around 7-ish years ago, back when Americans still put their priorities in the right place, partying and relaxing with your buds and their ladies. I would hope that we will now begin to reassert an American influence on American culture, since we are the original badasses after all. But I have to say that before evil foreign interests and corrupt local politicians started C-blocking all our fun, the Dogman was the first to stand up and get in the way of my personal good time. And that was because he single-handedly, or I guess single-pawedly, smacked down any chance that me and my bros could chill for that year's version of the Halloween weekend and watch all of the world's finest really bad VHS horror and sci-fi movies all weekend long. The rules for the multi-day party was that we lock up the cell phones when we arrived and only open the box if it was an emergency. We'd all vow to keep the VHS marathon going by putting another tape in when the last one ended. We had one machine dedicated to rewinding and the forehead one with the marginally better picture on movie duty. We weren't allowed to talk about any current events that happened after 1989, and we tried to only get food and drink brands that existed back in the 80s, as well as we could remember while we were out shopping. It was sort of like creating our own virtual reality vacation, but, in actual reality. One of our buds had control of his parents' old summer home for the winter, which was scheduled to be demolished and rebuilt in the spring. It had largely been gutted, but the plumbing and electricity weren't set to be turned off until a few weeks later. He had basically made one room livable by throwing old rugs around and putting all the house's mismatched old wooden shelves all together in that one place. Then we all brought as many old VHS tapes as we had, or could find, with us. And we stocked the shelves full into one communal super collection. The movies we had all seen before went onto the pile for overnights, when some of us might be sleeping. And the ones that some of us either really wanted to see or really wanted to show went onto the priority pile for when we were all most interested in watching. We had frozen and junk food. We had liquid refreshment. We had a working bathroom. And that meant we were all systems go for the world's single greatest Halloween movie marathon out in the woods of all time. So we spun this old cardboard and metal spinner from a board game that we had written our names over, and the guy who won chose our first film. I think it was Extra, but don't quote me on that. At any rate, we were only like 2 movies into the marathon when one of my friends started screaming like an alto soprano. I thought someone had stepped on his private, but it turned out he was looking at this face in the window. When the rest of us saw it, I think we screamed even higher than he had. It looked like a wolf man, but a really truly insane and terrifying one. When we all screamed, it ran away from the window, and we ran toward that window to see what the heck that was. I got there in time to see that creepy man thing running away, covered in fur, but not wearing one stitch of clothing. As it ran on 2 legs, but 2 legs unlike those of any man I'd ever seen, I realized it was an upright running wolfman, entirely covered in fur, growing out of its own skin. It was a man, and yet it was not any kind of man at all. Everybody was screaming. They all demanded their cell phones, and the box was opened. Some of them took to the woods to see if they could get a shot at the Dogman. One of them started posting to his other friends online that he had just seen a werewolf in real life. Everybody was buzzing about the Wolfman, and nobody really cared about creaky old VHS movies any longer. We all drove into the nearby town and partied out at a restaurant the way normies do it. That weird-faced, short-snouted wolfman ruined our geek Halloween weekend. I mean, we had a lot of fun, and one of the guys met the woman who would become his future wife that weekend, but I don't think we watched more than 4 or 5 old movies all weekend. It still makes me sad thinking back on it. We'll probably never again have a collection of such great movie nerds and such incredibly horrible films out in the country on Halloween. And that's the reason I'm calling this story Dogman versus Halloween. Our EP is CS, and that ain't no BS. 'Cause if you can still see us, then you can thank CS. Please join us in thanking CS for making this Halloween as orange and black as possible. She's our executive producer for this and for many of our shows, as we literally could not have gotten through to this year's holiday without her constant help. Dogman at the Renaissance Fair. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw you talking about a dogman that cut through the park where a Renaissance fair was held. In that account, the fair was not in season. My story is about a time when the dogman showed up while a fair was in progress. Journey with me back to the 1980s and I'll fill in as many details as I can remember. Now, this fair only happened once and then moved and soon was taken over by completely different people under a different name. The reason it moved around and changed hands was not because of the dogman, as I'm about to tell you the entirety of his visit to the edges of that fair that first somewhat experimental year. The guys who created the event were to sadly pass on during the AIDS era, which was already upon us, although few realized it as this story was taking place. The few who were becoming aware of it weren't even using terms like HIV or anything like that yet. I forget the names and conspiracy theories around it back then, but it took a while before it became officially recognized and named. So when I've thought back on this event, it's not just a time where we all dressed up to pretend it was the past, but the memories are filled up with people whose lives are entirely in the past as well. Even when I was 25 years old, most of the characters involved in this were gone already. I suppose people in this era can relate to that aspect of it, unfortunately. The reason I was there that year was that I had a bad crush on a girl we can call Guinevere. We sat next to each other in pre-calculus, and so I nearly failed that class. I couldn't concentrate when I was around her. When she talked me into going to the Renaissance Fair, I was ecstatic. I had no interest in any of that kind of stuff. I liked science fiction and superheroes. But if Guinevere wanted me to wear a puffy pirate shirt, then get me to the Adamant New Romantic clothing shop. Guys who are 18 will do pretty much anything for whoever they have a bad crush on. So I'm lucky this is the worst thing Gwen got me to do. If she'd have told me to rob a bank, I'd probably be writing this from prison, and there wouldn't be any Dogman in the story at all. Speaking of which, here was what happened with the creature's sighting. It was more than just a sighting for me. It was basically a real-life thrill ride that I almost didn't survive to tell you about. So back then, I was really skinny, which my grand-nephew doesn't believe. I've shown him an old photo, and he says that's Photoshop. But there really was a time when I was a beanpole. It lasted until I was around 32 or 33 maybe, and then I started filling out. But in those days, when this happened, I was a skinny kid, and I wore thick glasses because I was extremely nearsighted. The disadvantage of that is that you don't look glamorous for the ladies. But the good part of it is that a lot of girls automatically assumed I was very smart, since I looked like such a geek. This meant both that I could earn spending money and favors in exchange for tutoring, but also that they'd take pity on me and give me hints about how to impress this girl that I had a crush on. Having shared interests was something that I kept hearing, so I felt I had to at least try to like the whole Renaissance Fair thing. When I was actually there with Guinevere, I found myself even more self-conscious in the stupid old-timey clothing. And even though her friends were nice and welcoming toward me, I found myself finding excuses to go wander off alone. This wasn't my world. This was not where I wanted to be. I felt really bummed about it because it didn't seem that I had enough in common with Gwen to take this any further. Either I'd have to pretend I liked what she liked, or I'd have to be myself and accept that I could never really become her guy. To an 18-year-old, this was a major trauma, so I wandered off at the edge of the fair in order to work through my emotions without bringing anyone else down. It was there where my encounter with the Dogman began, but that was not where it ended. My grandfather had always told me that when I feel down, the worst thing I could do is to look down. He said look up at the trees and the sky, and you'll start to work yourself out of any depression. So I was looking upward and not watching where I was going when I stepped into something nasty. Looking down, I saw that there was a former chicken, which seemed to have been torn to shreds, all around beneath me. I noticed I was by a chicken coop which had a hole torn out of one side, yet none of the chickens inside seemed to want to come out. Down a ways past me, sitting down on a rock like it had been placed there just for him, was something that I can best describe as a humanoid canine. It wasn't sitting like a wolf or a dog. It was sitting like a human. And that was because it needed to have its hands, or at least its hand-like paws, free to hold the chicken it appeared to be gobbling down one big bite at a time. This huge man was covered in hair or fur, and although his feet strongly resembled the back legs of a dog, it was really only his head that made him definitively and undeniably inhuman. My first reaction was somewhat typical for someone as immature and sheltered as I was in those days. I looked around for someone to report the Dogman to, someone to rat him out to and get him in trouble with. My world had been so dominated by doing well within the school environment that I had never really learned much about solving problems on my own. That's okay though, because the Dogman was about to make my world a whole lot more real. So there was nobody around. People were all busy doing other things. I suppose that was the reason that the Dogman had been able to pilfer and devour 2 birds without one person even raising a slight fuss about it. The creature was quiet when he needed to be, and he was sly and sneaky as any panther or wildcat. That Dogman also possessed keen senses, and me spinning around on the crunchy autumn leaves had alerted him to the fact that there was a dumb kid looking for ways to cause him trouble. I don't think I really and fully understood that chicken might only be the appetizer on that Dogman's menu until I spun around and saw the beast's belly, more or less, in my face. I tilted my head back, then further back. Then I had to take a step away from the hairy man and tilt my entire body backward in order to see the drool oozing and dripping from the Tyrannosaurus jaws of this immense wolfman before it splattered sickeningly in my face. Now I smelled of raw chicken and bile, and I wanted to run away from my own body. Unable to do that, I did the next best thing, which was to run away from the Dogman. Into the woods I ran frantically like a chicken with his head cut off. In fact, that was sort of what I was seeking not to become. Behind me, the Dogman lumbered, making sounds that might have been panting, but to me sounded almost like a hyena laugh. It might have been in my mind, but it sure felt to me that this Dogman was enjoying getting a little exercise between courses of his meal. He seemed in no rush to catch up to me, but he wasn't going to let me get out of his sight either. Why I hadn't run into the fair where there were people to help me, I'm not really certain. I suppose it was a result of my alienation and nerdiness, but it could also have just been pure stupidity. Maybe I just didn't want Gwyn to get a sniff of me while I was smelling like the inside of a Dogman. In either case, onward I ran, until I actually found a tiny lake in the woods. Maybe it would be called a pond, I don't know, but it was maybe about 4.5 feet of water, and it was probably like 150 feet across, more or less. I dove in, pirate costume and all, and washed as much of that smell off of me as I could manage. On the edge of the little mini-lake was that Dogman, now sitting like a canine, both front paws on the ground, a big dog's smile on its nasty blood-covered face, and its contented panting continued to sound to me more like laughing than anything else. It was like nature's version of the Joker, and he had decided to make me his Batman of the day to torture and pursue. I wondered why he hadn't come into the water. Was he afraid of it? Was I safer there in the center of that giant puddle than I was anywhere else? I stared at the Dogman, trying to read his expression, but he just kept on panting in that way that made me feel as though I were being laughed at. Standing my ground, since I didn't have any better ideas, I remained in the center of the pond, cold water up to my midsection. In return, the Dogman sat there, seeming to giggle as he calmly observed me. Then an autumn breeze blew that gave me quite a shiver. Another breeze made my nose feel itchy, and I was soon sneezing. I had to get out of that pond, The weather was not cold out, but it wasn't warm enough for me to be messing around like this. So I took off walking toward the side of the pond opposite the Dogman. Walking was slow, and the bottom of the pond was muddier on this side than on the side I had walked in on. By the time I got close to the edge, the laughing hyena creature was there in front of me, seemingly enjoying my predicament. I turned to leave in a different direction, but the Dogman was able to get where I wanted to go faster on the edge of the pond than I could sludge and trudge there inside the water. I was now sneezing more frequently, and I knew I was going to end up getting sick from all of this. Still, I was unable to find an edge I could exploit to get myself up and out of that water. It was then that a group of kids my age emerged from the woods in the direction of the Renaissance Fair, and the Dogman literally kicked a small pile of dirt and mud up in the air as he bolted into the woods, being out of sight before any of those people even noticed that he had been there. They had spotted me in the water, and I seemed to be what they were looking for. When I had run into the woods, it seemed that someone alerted Gwen. Then she and some other girls and guys had begun the trek into the woods to rescue me before I got lost. When they saw me in the water sneezing, it seemed to be uproariously funny to them. I wished I could be invisible and shrink away, but I just walked up out of the water toward them so that they could lead me back to the camp and get me dried off and changed. It was excruciatingly embarrassing to be in that situation. They kept asking me why I was in the water in my clothing, and didn't I know that summertime was over, and questions like that. All sorts of queries were being flung in my direction, each of which was a legitimate thing to ask, but none of which I had any kind of answer to. And then I remembered the chicken coop that the Dogman had burst into, which started all this. That might help me prove my case, so I started telling them that they weren't going to find it easy to believe what I was about to say. But then I dived into it. I came across a very large individual who had broken into the back of the chicken coop at the edge of the forest. He was eating the birds, uncooked, and when he saw me, he spat on me, and I ran. When I found the water, I dove into it in order to clean myself off, and the chicken thief kept me trapped in that water. Then I told the Ren Fair people that when they showed up, that chicken liquor beat it off to parts unknown, and I was rescued. So this mostly true story was related to the owner of said chicken coop, who barged into the tent they had me stashed inside of. He wanted to hear my story for himself, so I nervously repeated it as his eyes bore into me, studying my every facial expression and eye movement. Finally, he pronounced my version of events to be a pack of lies, and I thought he was accusing me of stealing and eating his chickens. That wasn't what he meant, though. In front of everyone, this guy loudly shouted that his chickens were eaten by some kind of a large dog or wolf, and that I was lying about having seen a man. I nearly broke down crying, telling him that yes, it was the largest wolf I'd ever seen. I had never said it was a man or dog or bear or anything, as I'd been too afraid to admit what I'd actually been looking at. Yes, it was an animal, but it was an animal that stood up like a human. I had thought that they were ready to believe. I had thought that they were ready for the truth, since I had admitted that my first statement was a bit misleading, though. I had lost their faith, and now they didn't know what was up or down or left or right. The owner of the chicken coop demanded I tell him what I really saw, and to stop telling fables. I described for him the way the Dogman looked when he was sitting on the shore of the lake, because that was when he looked the most dog-like. He seemed to be more accepting of that description. When I was finished, I then described how he sat more like a human when I first saw him on that big rock. Then I described him walking, or strolling, up on his hind legs. He probably stood 8 or 9 feet tall when reared back like that. I told him all this sincerely, and the man stared back into my eyes. But I could tell he was not really understanding how much of what I was saying was a witness report, and how much of it was evidence of my possible insanity. He just sorta quietly left me alone after that, as he seemed to have been thoroughly befuddled by my testimony. I took a lot of ribbing as I got back into my street clothing and got ready to leave Guinevere's world, possibly forever. I said goodbye, and she said she'd walk me out to the bus stop, which surprised me. Along the way, though, she was telling me all sorts of little things that made me feel that she felt it was over between us. Like she told me that the Ren Fair was not my world, and that I had been brave to try it out. I felt like she was giving me the consolation prize speech, which at best ends with a promise to stay friends. In short, that Dogman had ruined our relationship. But the Dogman taketh, and then the Dogman giveth. In front of us on the path toward the local highway with the bus stop, a dog-headed hairy humanoid, somewhere between 5 and 6 feet tall, burst out of the woods in front of us and to our left, racing across the path we were walking on, and entering the woods on the other side so fast that we were barely able to understand what we had seen. It was not just shorter but also thinner than the chicken-stealing one, but it was the same long-snouted upright species. Before it had even jumped back into the woods, it was followed by a creature that was even a bit larger than the first one I had seen. This creature was so big that Gwyn gasped and fell backward onto her Renaissance butt. We both stayed there, listening to the creatures receding in the distance, to our front and our right, and as I helped her up to her feet, Guinevere asked me if I had bus fare for 2 people. She wanted to get out of Dodge. On the bus heading to my town, everyone stared at my medieval girlfriend, who clung so close to me. They didn't understand the shock that the 2 of us had just been through, and I was fine. Everything was fine to me since the Dogman had scared this girl out of the forest and onto my bus. My parents were enchanted by her, fed her dinner, and drove her home, where they met her parents. It was weird how much they all got along with each other. Unheard of, to be honest. My dad always stared at her a bit in amazement, and he told me 3 times before he passed on that he never expected me to find such an exotic and interesting woman. My dad, he was a great guy, but he didn't understand nerd stuff, and he had always been disappointed that I wasn't into sports and athletics. Gwyn marrying me later on was the only reason I got to be friends with my dad, because he felt that any guy Gwyn liked that much must be okay, in spite of being such a geek. She caused him to give me a second chance, and the Dogman caused Gwyn to do the same. Our daughter, who is now expecting her own child, jokingly asked us if we would recommend that she see the Dogman with her husband to make sure the marriage lasts as long as ours. We both answered no. It was sheer luck that things worked out for us. But the Dogman is not something to joke around about. Gwyn and I are aware that we do owe the beast a debt of thanks. But at the same time, we feel strongly that we were meant to be together. If it hadn't happened that one way, then it would have happened another. We each agree strongly that we both wish we had never seen the Dogman, as it is not a kind of creature that you can ever unsee. We both have seen therapists to cope with the nightmares we have of waking up to see the beast. My recurring dream is that I think I'm awake, and I look up to see that disgusting Dogman, covered in the insides of a chicken, standing over our bed, drooling on me. I'll sometimes wake up screaming from that one, and other times I wake up and find myself unable to utter a sound for some time afterward. So no, the Dogman experiences we had were traumatic, and we would not wish them on anyone, or try to make a joke out of them. Granted, Gwyn and I do kid around about the Dogman still to this day, but that's a coping mechanism between us when you're dealing with something that frightened you terribly. People make jokes about death, too, but that doesn't mean they actually think it's funny. It's just a way to numb yourself a bit about accepting the inevitable. Believe it or not, both Guinevere and I would rather that we never laid eyes on. Dogman at the Renaissance Fair. I forget our donation from Butch Rudrick because I'm not good at arithmetic. But thanks to Butch, we survived the putsch, and now I'll go listen to music. Please join us in thanking Butch Rudrick, who became a channel member and gets to see our secret uncensored stories. 2 Detroit Dogman stories. Number 1. The Beast of Brightmoor. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I just want to alert you to something that I've been unable to get our local police to do anything about. Then again, they won't do much of anything that happens in this part of Detroit. And now we're so abandoned by the city that we're even experiencing a growing problem of Dogman infestation. The only people who will take me seriously about this are other folks in the neighborhood who have also seen the creatures, or heard the creatures, or had to clean up the kind of destruction that they leave in their wake. First of all, I should cue you in that I live in a place that's not like most of America. It's pretty much been allowed to rot, and there are only a little more than a third the amount of people even trying to live up over here, as compared to when I was born in 1990. This used to be a busy place, with lots of private homes and a lot of hope for the future. Now some blocks have one house left. Other blocks might not have any at all. Someone keeps mowing the grass during the day when I'm at work. Is it the city? I don't know. Do landlords still own that now useless land? Are they hoping that someday it might be safe enough to build new homes here? To me, it looks like the city might have taken responsibility for maintaining at least some of it. But what do I know? I mind my own business, and I keep to myself. Normally I wouldn't even squawk about the Dogman, but it's reached such a point that I'm now even more afraid of the Dogman than I am of the gangs. Both of them are prone to travel in packs, but the Dogmen seem even meaner. The gangs might leave you for dead, but usually they won't actually eat you alive. To be honest, I don't even know if there are gangs left. I look outside and I rarely see anyone come onto my block at all. I usually get my groceries delivered, and the most I'll see of the outside world is the view from the front door as I accept packages. At night, when I see figures moving around through the darkness outside, I just assume those aren't humans out there. Or maybe I should say that if any of those shadows moving out there in the night are human, they sure better get back inside before they get noticed by the other ones. The bigger ones. The hairier ones. These upright walking werewolf-looking sons of real actual canine females. Again, like I said, I don't even look outside any longer if I can prevent it. So, for all I know, the Dogmen have left and been replaced with gnomes and orcs. I just kinda keep my blinders on and I mind my own business. I'm too wrapped up with my job to do anything about it. And anyway, what could I even do? The police don't come around here when I call. They tell me there are no units available. Doesn't even matter when I call. Any time of day they have no police available, if it means having to come over to the part of town where I'm still, for some reason, trying to live. I first remember hearing about the Dogman from some people that were able to afford to move out. They told me all about it before they left. I thought they must be on something, or that maybe they'd lost their minds. But then, one day, when the weather was really nice and sunny, I decided I wanted to walk over to Motor City Soul Food on Telegraph Road, which is a good 45-minute or an hour walk down some cracked old streets. I wanted to take a different route, walk north a bit first, and then go over to the park over there with the Rouge River and the nature trail. That was the first day it really started to dawn on me that our entire neighborhood had started to become a nature area. I didn't have to walk over to the river to see a wild animal in its modern habitat on that day. In fact, I'd hardly gone a block when I passed an abandoned home that had a new resident, and it was not a human one either. This was one of my first lessons teaching me to stop being so curious about my neighbors. In retrospect, with all the things I almost hadn't lived through already up to then, this was something that you'd thought I'd have learned years earlier. I think that whenever a tough guy got pushy with me, it got me mad. And when the law shoved me, that also got me angry. But after what I'm about to describe to you, I shut right up, and I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Dogman, sir." There's no human on Earth that can make me afraid of him. But I'm not going to start talking back to the Michigan Dogman. So the day was sunny, and I had nobody anywhere around. No pedestrians, no cars, nothing. Just me, trees, grass, cracked roads, and sometimes remnants of a former sidewalk, now mostly as overgrown as an abandoned Mayan city. I came upon a house looking empty, covered in a blue tarp. I didn't know those people had moved out. It seemed in quite a state of disrepair, and I wondered if it would get torn down, or if it would turn into another rat and cockroach breeding nest. I caught sight of some movement inside the house, and I turned to look a little more closely to see if it was any of the people I had seen living there before. What I saw in there looking back at me had shoulders so broad that I thought I was seeing the silhouette of a large man wearing football shoulder pads. His eyes seemed to be glowing a weird color, and I assumed he was wearing sunglasses that were reflecting light from the sunny day outside. But when the man leaned forward, I shrieked in terror like a scream queen from the horror movies. No, I'm not a lady, but you'd never have known it if you heard me when I saw that face on that creature. Now, sometimes I hear you and other people on the internet talking about how beautiful the Dogman is. Oh, it's such a magnificent example of nature or whatever. Well, this Dogman had a face that made you go, ah. His face made me jump up in the air and backwards. You know, I've been in situations before. I've had a loaded weapon held on me. And you know what, I didn't scream like I did when I saw how ugly that Dogman face was. He wasn't going to win any dog beauty pageants unless it was a Halloween contest. This guy had a mug that looked like it started out wanting to be a wolf face, but somehow midway through, it tried to also be some kind of deformed hell demon head at the same time. It leaned out the window, which was barely wide enough for him to stick his giant head through, and it was clear that what I thought were sunglasses were in reality its own eyes, exhibiting a strong reflective quality, or else an internal illumination of some sort. I felt grateful that it was inside, and I was outside, as I'd never seen such a large canine. I wasn't fully understanding that this wasn't just a dog. I also had not really comprehended that it was bipedal, even though my first impression was that I was witnessing a large human male. Then, it did something that would have surprised me, no matter what kind of being I was thinking that it was. This beast man with shoulders wider than that window somehow leaped through that open window anyway, landing on his front legs, and beginning a quadrupedal gallop toward me. You know, I did run, but it was fruitless, and the creature had caught up to me without very much effort at all. I fell forward hard, getting the wind knocked out of me. Soon enough, the dogman was standing on my back, and I was finding it increasingly harder to breathe. When a creature is that big and heavy, it can suffocate you without having to strangle you. I remember being unable to escape, and that I blacked out right there, face down on the asphalt of Blackstone. I woke up back home on my bed, but don't ask me if I was carried there or if I sleepwalked, because I don't remember. Nobody's ever come forward to let me know what they might know about this incident, so all I can say is I blacked out on the street and I woke up at home with an aching chest. Was I saved by someone? Did the dogman himself carry me home? Was I levitated by Dr. Strange? I honestly can't tell you. It was a night or two after that when I got up to go take a pee in the middle of the night, and I saw something moving around outside my bathroom window. It's frosted glass, so all I could really see was a silhouette. When I got done doing what I had to do, I climbed quietly into the bathtub so I could get as close as possible to that bathroom window. Then I counted to 3, flung the window open, and shouted,
"Get off my lawn!"
in the deepest voice I could manage. Rather than scaring a teenager away from my house, I found myself staring directly into the glowing eyes of another one of those really demonic and ugly-looking dogman beasts. I slammed the window down, but the animal was too fast for me. His arm was through the tiny narrow window, and his hand was large enough to wrap completely around my throat. I did this desperate move that I guess could have gotten me killed. I sort of climbed the wall in front of me like Jackie Chan, and when I was standing on that wall, perpendicular to the ground, being held up only by the long dogman arm around my neck, I pushed suddenly and hard against the wall, and that dogman was forced to briefly loosen his grip. I flew backward hard, landing partially on the tile floor, and partially on the side of the bathtub, which was not pleasant, and which has led to chronic pain ever since. What it did not lead to, though, was my death. I remember slowly getting myself back up to standing position as I watched that dogman arm, still seemingly stuck in the narrow, frosted bathroom window, flailing about, reaching blindly for me, and causing soaps and sponges to get knocked all about. I ran for my room to get my phone and call the police. Then I thought I'd better take a picture of the arm in the window first. That way the police would know I was telling the truth. When I got back to the bathroom, however, the arm was gone. I closed and locked the window, and then I went to bed. The cops weren't coming out to my house because of a dogman report, even if I had a motion picture of the thing in full stereo and 3D. I could have live drone footage of the thing walking away and it still wouldn't matter. Listen, I know a few people around here who might be willing to talk about stuff that's happened to them concerning the dogman. Some of them moved away, but they might be okay with telling a story or two about the old days. Some still live around here, and I don't know if they even want to think about the dogman. If you've made it to 2022 in this place, man, you've been through a lot. It means you're strong, but it also means you've taken your share of beatings. Emotional ones, financial, and any other way I'm blocking out here. The dogman seems like one more insult to me. One more slap in the face. One more show of complete and utter disrespect for all of us who once made this place a nice part of Detroit. There are a lot of us who feel like we fought a real honest-to-God war here. It should seem pretty obvious from the blocks and blocks of weeds and trees where houses used to be that most of us don't exactly feel like we won that fight. So anyway, let me know if this story is too sad or weird for you, or if you'd like me to see if I can send you more stories about this newest demon to plague Detroit's residents. Because believe me, I've only scratched the surface what I'm talking about. The Beast of Brightmoor. We asked this person who emailed us to go ahead and send any more stories he'd like to concerning Dogman, and he has sent us a few. Here's just one, although this is the most recent. Remember in the last story where he said he was walking over to the park with the nature trail? Well, that's where his friend had another Dogman sighting. Check this out and let us know what you think. The Dogman inside the giant nest. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my friend told me to write to you about my Dogman experience. He only knows about the one. I've actually had to deal with that thing a few more times since then, each of those times closer to my home. On this day, I was out jogging with my fiancée, who is a police officer. She was off duty, obviously, and it was a Sunday morning back in May. Suddenly the sky got all dark as clouds covered the sun, and a little bit of winter whipped around, giving me a chill. That was the first time I remember seeing the Stickworks sculpture or statue over there. It's basically a big weird bird's nest large enough to climb inside of. We jogged toward it, looking for some cover from the weather, as we expected a brief thunderstorm was about to happen. So we approached this little house thing, which apparently was created by someone named Patrick Doherty, and we definitely intended to try to go inside through one of the openings. Before we got within 30 feet, though, my better half grabbed me by the arm and stopped me from getting any closer to the structure. "There's already someone inside it," she whispered to me. I thought she was seeing things, so I walked over toward the sculpture, looking into each opening in turn, and seeing nothing inside that 12th dimensional nest but air. Dry air. Dry air that I would prefer being in than wet air that I felt I was about to have dropped on my head from above. Seeing no trouble, I turned around and signaled to my fiancée that everything was fine and the coast was clear. She shook her head no and pointed back at the structure. I turned around and saw nothing moving. She just kept pointing anyway. And quite frankly, I thought she was being ridiculous. So I walked right up to that stick house, and I was nearly going to put my head inside an opening and look around when the Dogman, who had been inside the entire time, looked out at me. I won't say that he was as scared to see me as I was to see him, but I will say, well, it certainly was of interest to him. He showed off his very, very, very long teeth as he growled more deeply than a motorcycle engine. Now that, in turn, was certainly very much of interest to me. In terms of its appearance, I'd say that your thumbnail Dogman with the tall ears was fairly close. I don't think this one was quite as buff as those. This guy was a bit thinner and probably not as tall. I think he was maybe 6'2" or 6'3", but I don't think he was a giant. His eyes looked absolutely sick, like something out of science fiction, or else Harry Potter. They didn't just shine, they seemed to pulsate and be putting on this whole digital light show, changing somehow every single moment. Yes, it had hands, and yet it was more of a dog than a human. Now, while the two of us were finding each other so interesting, my girlfriend behind me was finding the entire situation impossible and intolerable. She was expressing this by screaming at me to get away from the animal man. Her voice was high-pitched and shrill, which seemed to cause the Dogman physical pain, and she was cursing up a blue streak, which I find low class and unladylike. The Dogman was so powerfully disturbed by the sounds coming from my woman's vocal cords that he began flailing about inside that structure, and I saw it start to kind of rock as he bashed into wall after wall, unable to stop the unending torment to his ears. I think my wife must be able to hit some notes too high for even me to hear. But that Dogman, he sure was hearing them. And he was not enjoying them. It looked like he was getting ready to rip his ears right out of his head, just to make it stop. Since the Dogman was preoccupied, I went back to my future wife and calmed her down. We beat it out of there while that Dogman did what he had to do to pull himself back together. We got one of the cops my wife works with to go back to the structure with us, but we were unable to find either the Dogman or any evidence of his having been there. Maybe he only jumped inside to avoid the forthcoming rain, same as we had been thinking about doing. I wonder if that was the only time he was ever there, or if he uses the structure for shelter often. Since much of our part of town has essentially gone back to nature, I believe we are in a unique position to study an obviously very rare species. And it doesn't even officially exist yet, which means whoever proves it's real gets to name it. All I'm saying is that if you ever hear that the Dogman was found and it's been given a scientific name based on Cujo, then you know I'm the one that found and proved the existence of the Dogman inside the giant nest. Chris Nihis upgraded his membership. That's why he's so great in Novembership. Please join me in thanking Chris Nihis for upgrading his channel membership and making this episode possible. My election night. Dogman drama. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've worked security jobs for 23 years now, and I've had a number of crazy experiences in my day. The only story I've got for you which involves a cryptid happened, believe it or not, the first or second year that I worked a school used for a polling station up in northern Wisconsin. I would work Woodruff some years and St. Germain others, or at least one year. I kind of get them confused and mixed up in my mind because I'm from Michigan and not all that familiar with the area over there in Wisconsin. I would drive there, do my job, and then go back to my other security job the next day. It wasn't like I thought I'd be trying to write it all down in a coherent format for a YouTube channel 20 years later. I don't even remember if there was a YouTube back when this happened. So I wasn't really paying as close attention as maybe I might have if someone had warned me in advance that this was about to be the most memorable night of my life. So there's this rule, or I guess it's actually a law, that says you can't try to get people to vote for your candidate within, I think it's 100 feet of the poll entrance. It's usually marked off, or I get someone to show me. I've hardly ever had any major issues, as in the Midwest, people have usually acted pretty civilized while voting. I might get sore feet from standing around, but that's usually the worst of it. This one year, though, things got really weird. This was sometime in the early 2000s, but like I said before, I can't tell you exactly which year. I think the polls were set to close at 8 that night, but when that time arrived, amazingly, there was still a long line out the front door leading down past the 100-foot marker. We had to, by law, stay open until the last person who got online by 8 had been given their chance to vote. So I got ready to work some overtime. While standing up front near the entrance, I received a few complaints from people that said that there was an individual wearing a gray fur coat. It was a cold night, maybe that narrows the year down, who was electioneering for this one candidate. They were also handing out free coffee to try to influence votes. The thing is, I couldn't see them from where I was, and I could see all the way to the end of the no electioneering zone. That meant that they had to have been around the corner of the end of the school building, and that was outside the zone. Perfectly legal. He was allowed to plug his candidate down over there. I told people that, and they called me names that I won't repeat here. I told them that I was only doing my job, and that I had no job past the end of that building. One lady mocked me, comparing me to a German from the 1940s who was only following orders. She didn't seem to get it, that if I went past 100 feet and bothered someone who was electioneering, I would be the one in the wrong. I would be the bully, and I might even be breaking the law, or opening myself up to a lawsuit by acting like that. Anyway, a while later, when that lady was leaving after voting, she brought someone from inside who ordered me to go investigate this person who was allegedly electioneering. Again, I pointed to the end of the block, and I showed him that there was nobody there in a fur coat at all. It was almost 9 o'clock, and the line was finally starting to wind down. Whatever electioneering had been happening had been taking place in the legal area past the end of the zone. And since the line no longer stretched back that far, they had no doubt packed up and left. This angry guy from inside, though, he was undeterred, and he insisted that I walk down around the corner to investigate. Feeling stupid, but not really having much of a choice, I walked down the block toward the corner. Whatever the cross street was, it had sure gotten dark over there. I remember thinking how odd it was that a street with a school on it could be so poorly lit as that one was. It started sort of creeping me out the closer I got to it. I was really praying that when I peeked around the corner, I'd see an empty block. No such luck. I quietly approached the edge of the building, not 100% sure why I felt as frightened as I did. When looking around and down the cross street, it was kind of darker than I expected it to be. There were streetlights, but the first two were out on my side of the block. I'm telling you, something about it gave me the goosebumps. It looked like a block that Freddy Krueger might be haunting. I wanted to turn back and tell the cranky guy inside that the coast was clear. If I did that, though, I would be lying, because I could see that there was clearly a big guy standing a bit further down the block. Although most of the detail about him seemed to be in shadow, I could see silvery gray fur, reflecting the little bits of light that did exist in the gloomy November night. I feel that there are no bad jobs, only bad employees, and that the only way I can hold my head high and be proud of myself is if I am always honest on my job, and if I always try my best to do what has been asked of me. I wanted to run back to the polling place and say nobody was there, but I would have been lying, so for me, that wasn't an option. Instead, I took a tentative step toward the big guy, trying to think up what I might say to him once I arrived. I didn't feel I had the legal right to say anything at all past hello or have a nice night, but I was going to have to gently and legally get this guy to move on without getting myself sued if he turned out to have a lawyer brother or something like that. Step after step, I drew closer to the guy, who was way taller than he had seemed to me at first. It seemed the road dipped a bit where he was standing, and as I walked down into the dip, he seemed bigger and bigger with each step. I could see the broad, gray, furry shoulders facing away from me, and at first, I thought about tapping on one of them. And then, I wondered if that could be misconstrued as assault if he had a fancy enough lawyer, and I figured I'd better politely call out to him instead. I got to within 15 or 20 feet of the big bruiser, who looked from his silhouette as though he were an NFL linebacker, and I cleared my throat to say something. This guy turned around so fast that I leaped backward in surprise and tripped, slamming down hard onto the sidewalk on my butt in a way that hurt pretty bad, but didn't break anything or injure me seriously. I was not going to be able to climb back to my feet for another 5 or 10 seconds, though, and in that time, this guy was standing over me, leaning down, and screaming at me from a mouth that didn't look like any mouth I'd ever seen before. It wasn't until he finished his scream and pulled backward into the air above me that I understood. This was not a man. This was some kind of an animal. Its mouth was more like a dog nose and snout, but with teeth in that long mouth, bigger than I'd ever seen even on any other kind of canine. I mean, I've been to a wolf zoo, and the wolves did not have teeth like this guy did. He was some kind of animal, far larger and more savage than a wild wolf. The face did bear a lot of resemblance to gray wolves, though. It's just that it was a larger and more evil-looking version of a wolf, is I guess what you would say. While he was bending over me, I was able to peripherally view his body, which seemed to me to be more similar to a very tall boxer or wrestler than anything canine. Its head was a dog or wolf kind of a thing, but the body was, I guess, more like a Bigfoot or a hairy human. I got asked about the feet or hind legs, and I'm sorry, but I was just not thinking that I would need to be paying attention to that at the time. I do remember that it had hands, but hands like a monster would have in a movie. Imagine a monster in your closet or under the bed from a show like Tales from the Dark Side. It would probably have hands like this thing had. They were not dog paws, but they were clawed. At the time, I think I was more concerned about the fact that it was drooling onto me. I wanted to get away, but I sensed that any sudden movement would be greeted with extreme violence. I don't think this thing was wearing any clothing at all, but like I said, it was dark. The impression I had was that he was covered in fur, as in his own fur, not pelts wrapped around him. He was not a man wearing a fur skin. He was some kind of an animal that was shaped like a man, other than that prehistoric-looking savage proto-wolf head that was leaking all over me. It was an extremely tense moment, and the longer the creature looked at me, the less I felt that this was gonna have a happy ending. I wasn't just feeling scared. I was starting to feel sad as well. The giant head of that dog monster leaned in close enough for me to smell its dog breath, and it began sniffing me loudly. It tickled, but I was hardly laughing. I felt as though any second the creature was going to bite a huge chunk out of some part of me, and that I was not going to ever see anyone I loved ever again. I closed my eyes, and I began to pray to God for forgiveness. Even while internally praying, I could hear how silent everything had become. Even with my eyes shut, I noticed that the scene had brightened up significantly. Squinting and blinking my eyes back open, I saw that the streetlight directly above me, which had been out, was now back on, full power. I didn't see the Dogman any longer, though. Sitting up quickly, I could see it running away down the street where the next streetlight had now gone out. As the beast ran into the range of the third, fourth, and fifth lamps on the block, they each turned off too, and the one behind blinked a few times as it came back on. Wherever the dog-headed man-thing ran, the light went out. When it got far enough away, the light came back on. That was all I could take, so I ran back to the polling place, and I didn't stop till I was inside, using the men's room. Honestly, I just wanted to hide in there until lockup time, but after I calmed down, I realized that would be unethical. When that angry manager asked me if I had talked with the man in the fur coat, I almost laughed. Then I told him that I had chased him off with my more manly scent, and the guy just sort of looked at me, and then backed away slowly. Little did he know, I was only sharing the truth with him about my election night Dogman drama. Dogman disliked our candidate. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a weird Pennsylvania Dogman story for you. Actually, maybe it was a werewolf story. In fact, I think that might make more sense. In either case, it was a dog-headed humanoid with glowing eyes, so I may call it any number of things as I tell you about what happened. This was 2008, when I briefly became interested in politics. I was canvassing or going door to door for a candidate. I'm not going to say who, but it's someone I would never campaign for ever again, I'll just say that. At the time, though, I was young and naive, and I was trying my best to do good in the world. I remember they had me paired with this guy my age, Dustin, and we had to go from door to door asking people to vote for our candidate and leaving some paper propaganda with them if they would let us. Most people were polite, but the only ones glad to see us were the extremely lonely. We had to make a point of limiting our time with them. Unless they offered us food, that is. We were both on a budget, and any free meals we could get, we would not turn down. When this next thing happened, though, we almost found ourselves on the free meal menu. So I could tell you the exact address of this place, but the house has been torn down since then. All I'm going to give you is Western PA, which you probably could guess once you hear how weird this one gets. At any rate, Dustin and I positioned our smiling, friendly young selves in front of this sort of run-down-looking private two-story dwelling. And before I rang the bell, Dustin once again asked if we could please skip this house. Of course, in retrospect, he was right, and I was wrong. But without me being stupid, we wouldn't even have a story here. So, idiot that I was, I rang the doorbell, which made no noise. You would have thought that would be enough reason to move on to the next house, but I was very single-minded in those days. Dustin pointed out the empty lots to either side of this house, where it looked like other houses had once stood. I think this place has the plague, is what Dustin suggested to me, but I moronically pressed onward and knocked loudly on the wooden front door. Dustin waited just 1 second before beginning to insist that nobody was home, and that we should get out of there. I was about to take his suggestion to heart when we both heard heavy footsteps inside the house, heading slowly but steadily toward us at the front door. I was happy to hear this, and I plastered my smile on my face, but Dustin's eyes got wide, and he backed away to stand behind me. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the door swung open outward, slamming into me and knocking me backward into Dustin. He took off running, and I tripped and landed backward, looking up at the door, which had flown off its hinges and was zooming through the air at my head. Rolling over to get out of its way, I could hear some kind of animal noise coming from that house, and when I looked, sure enough, I saw an animal standing there. This was a bipedal animal, covered in fur, but it was not human, it was not ape, and it was not a bear either. Its long snout, ending in a black nose, told me it was a dog, as well as the tall pointed ears up on top of its cranium. Nothing else about it seemed very canine to me, especially not its broad chest and muscular, ape-like arms. It had a savage expression and these pale blue, almost white eyes that seemed lit up from the inside with electric light. It filled the doorframe all the way to the top, and it was slightly bent over in order to fit into it at all. I'm not good with judging height, but it was taller than anyone I'd ever seen. I've never been near a standing bear, so I can't say if this was taller or shorter than that. And I don't know how big a Sasquatch is supposed to be either. All I know is I was not expecting that to come to the door. The creature did not immediately run out to attack me, which I took as a good sign, but he did begin to scream at me in a way that was extraordinarily intimidating. I got up and ran, and I didn't care if it was going to run after me either. It would be better to die while trying to escape than lying there and being shouted to death. People asked me if it howled or if it barked, but it really did feel more like I was being screamed or shouted at. It was just shouting coming out of a dog mouth, so it was not very articulate. It still carried the same feeling with it. He didn't think very much of me. In fact, he disliked me intensely. And so he wanted me to get off his lawn, which is what I did, as quickly as I could. I regrouped with Dustin at the place we'd agreed beforehand to go to lunch at. I asked him if he thought we should put the Dogman on the mailing list for our candidate. And what should we classify him as? Left? Right? Or independent? He didn't think my stand-up routine was very funny. In fact, he was really shaken up and wanted to quit the job on the spot. I talked him out of quitting, but I had to promise him that whenever he felt a weird vibe from a house from then on, I would agree to skip that place. I didn't really have a choice but to agree to his terms, but I was pretty cranky about it. Still, I did stick to the agreement. We only skipped a few homes, and we didn't have any more trouble after that. Maybe Dustin did have a good instinct about which places to avoid. Or maybe it was just that Dogman disliked our candidate. Our executive producer is Mary Shabazz. She made this show happen, whereas without her we would most likely have nary a chance for survival without dear Mary. Please join us in thanking the grand and glorious Mary Shabazz for making this episode possible. She is a top tier member and therefore gets to check out all our perks, including the 2 secret episodes, 2, not 1 but 2, that we put out just yesterday for members only. If you'd like to find out more, then listen to our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.